beneath the cherry blossoms. The early light of dawn stretched lazily across the skyline, washing the Han River in shades of soft amber and silver. A light breeze rustled through the cherry blossoms, their delicate petals drifting in the air like fragments of forgotten memories. The city, still caught between slumber and wakefulness, exhaled in quiet peace. Yoon Ji-eun stood on the bridge, her fingers lightly brushing the cold metal railing, her gaze distant as she stared at the horizon. Beneath her composed expression, a storm brewed, a tempest of uncertainty, grief, and a quiet, persistent ache she couldn't seem to shake. The night before had left her raw. Her father, a once vibrant man whose booming laughter could light up a room, had been reduced to a shadow of himself. His illness, which they had hoped was gone for good, had returned with a vengeance. And this time, the doctors didn't speak of hope. They spoke of palliative care, of time measured in weeks instead of years. His words still echoed in her mind, low and soft but firm. It was time for her to come home, to take over the family's small publishing house. The company he had built with his own hands, the business that had carried them through lean years and prosperous ones, was now her responsibility. It was what he wanted, what he needed. But Ji-eun wasn't sure if it was what she wanted. She had spent years carving out a life on her own terms, avoiding the expectations that had always loomed over her. She was a freelance writer, content to live in the margins, to observe and create from the sidelines. The idea of stepping into her father's shoes, of being the one in charge, felt like a role she wasn't ready to play. She sighed, a soft, tired sound that was swallowed by the gentle hum of the river. Turning away from the railing, she cast one last glance at the horizon before making her way down the bridge, her steps slow and heavy. It was then that she noticed him. Sitting on a weathered bench by the riverbank, a man sat with his head bowed, his hands loosely clasped in his lap. His shoulders were slumped, as though carrying an invisible weight, and there was a stillness about him that seemed almost unnatural, like he had forgotten how to breathe. Something about him caught Ji-eun's attention. A flicker of recognition, perhaps, though she was certain they had never met. There was something achingly familiar in the way he sat there, as if the river held answers he wasn't ready to hear. For a moment, she considered approaching him, but the thought drifted away as quickly as it had come. She turned and walked on, her mind already shifting back to the weight of her own troubles. Kang Min-jae had been coming to this bench every morning for a week. It was the only place where the chaos in his mind seemed to quiet down, where the relentless buzz of the world faded into the background. He had spent the past 10 years chasing success, climbing the corporate ladder with a single-minded focus that left little room for anything else. He had the high-rise office, the designer suits, the carefully curated life that looked perfect from the outside. But perfection had come at a cost. His mother had always worried about him, afraid that he was losing himself in the pursuit of a life that wasn't truly his. She had been the one constant in his life, the anchor that kept him grounded. And now she was gone. The grief hit him in waves, sudden and overwhelming, catching him off guard when he least expected it. He thought of the art school he had left behind, the dreams he had buried in favor of something more practical, more secure. He thought of the sketches that once covered his walls, now hidden away in a dusty corner of his apartment. His mother had loved his art. She used to say his paintings could make the stars jealous. But he had stopped painting long before she fell ill, and now it felt too late to start again. Min-jae stared at the river, its surface rippling gently under the morning breeze. He wondered if it was possible to go back, to undo the choices that had led him here. But the past felt like a closed door, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to open it. As he rose to leave, his gaze fell on the bench beside him. There, lying on the worn wooden slats, was a notebook. Its leather cover was soft and frayed at the edges, as though it had been carried around for years. Curious, he picked it up and flipped it open. The pages were filled with sketches and handwritten notes, rough but alive, full of raw emotion. There were quick, jagged lines that hinted at frustration and softer, more delicate strokes that spoke of hope. He traced his fingers over a sketch of a tree by the river, its branches reaching upward like outstretched arms. On the inside cover, written in neat, careful handwriting, was a name, Yoon Ji-eun. Back in her apartment, Ji-eun sat at her cluttered desk, staring blankly at her computer screen. Empty coffee mugs and crumpled pieces of paper surrounded her, evidence of the sleepless night she had spent trying to write. But the words wouldn't come. She reached for her bag, intending to pull out her notebook, the one place where her thoughts always seemed to flow freely. But her hand met nothing but the smooth fabric of the bag's lining. Her heart stopped. Frantically, she dumped the contents of the bag onto the desk, scattering pens, receipts, and loose change across the surface. But the notebook wasn't there. Panic set in as she retraced her steps in her mind, trying to remember where she had last seen it. And then it hit her, the bench by the river. She must have left it there. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door, her pulse racing. That notebook wasn't just a collection of sketches and notes. It was a piece of her soul, the one place where she had allowed herself to be truly honest. Losing it felt like losing a part of herself. She ran all the way to the river, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she reached the bench, but it was empty. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She sank down onto the bench, her head in her hands, trying to calm the storm inside her. She had lost things before, jobs, relationships, pieces of herself, but this felt different. This felt like too much. The next day, Min-jae found himself back at the bench, the notebook tucked under his arm. He had spent the night flipping through its pages, captivated by the world they revealed. The sketches told stories of love, loss, and resilience, while the notes hinted at a fierce determination to find beauty in even the darkest moments. It was a mirror to his own struggles, and he felt an inexplicable connection to the stranger who had created it. As he waited, he wondered what she was like. Was she quiet and introspective, like her sketches suggested? Or was there a fire in her, hidden beneath the surface? He didn't have to wonder for long. Ji-eun appeared, her eyes scanning the riverbank until they landed on him. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze as she noticed the notebook in his hands. She approached cautiously, her steps hesitant but purposeful. Min-jae watched her, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't quite explain. And as she reached out to take the notebook, their hands brushed for the briefest of moments. A fleeting, silent connection that left them both wondering what it meant. Ji-eun cradled the notebook in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover, as though reassuring herself it was real. Relief washed over her, but it was tempered by something else, something unfamiliar and unsettling. She could feel his gaze on her, the quiet intensity of it, and for a moment she didn't know what to do. She offered a small nod, an unspoken thank you, before turning to leave. But as she walked away, she felt the weight of the moment lingering, as though something had shifted, some invisible thread woven between them. Back at her apartment, Ji-eun placed the notebook on her desk, but she didn't open it. Instead, she sat staring at it, her mind replaying the brief encounter by the river. There had been something in his eyes, something sad and distant, yet quietly searching. It reminded her of the way she had felt standing on that bridge, staring at the horizon and wondering where to go next. She shook off the thought and turned her attention back to her writing. But the words wouldn't come. Her mind kept drifting back to the man by the river, to the silent exchange that had felt far more significant than it should have. Min-jae sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him. He had spent the rest of the morning thinking about her, Yoon Ji-eun. He wondered what her story was, what had driven her to fill that notebook with sketches and notes that were so raw, so alive. He wasn't used to feeling this way. For years, he had kept himself carefully closed off, focused on his career, on achieving goals that had once seemed so important. But now, everything felt different. His mother's death had cracked something open in him, and he wasn't sure how to put it back together. The apartment was too quiet. He reached for a sketch pad he hadn't touched in months and began to draw, his hand moving almost instinctively across the page. Before he knew it, he had sketched the scene from that morning, the river, the bench, and the girl with the notebook in her hands. He stared at the drawing for a long time, lost in thought. There was something about her that he couldn't quite explain, something that made him want to know more. But he didn't know if he would ever see her again. Over the next few days, Jian found herself returning to the river, her steps almost involuntary. She wasn't sure what she was looking for or why she felt drawn to that place. But each time she reached the bench, she found herself glancing around, half expecting to see him there. And then one morning he was. Min-jae was sitting on the bench, his sketchpad resting on his lap, his head bent as he drew. He didn't notice her at first, and for a moment Ji-yeon hesitated. She could turn around, walk away, and pretend she hadn't seen him. But something kept her rooted to the spot. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward him, her steps slow and measured. As she drew closer, he looked up, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. There was a brief pause, a moment suspended in time, before he closed the sketchpad and moved it aside, making room for her on the bench. She sat down, leaving a small space between them, and together they stared out at the river, the silence between them comfortable and unforced. It became a quiet ritual. Every morning they would meet at the bench by the river, their paths converging without the need for words. Sometimes, Ji-yeon would bring her notebook and sketch while Min-jae worked in his sketchpad. Other times, they would simply sit in silence, watching the river flow past, its surface ever-changing yet constant. Bit by bit, their walls began to crumble. Ji-yeon started to notice the small things, the way Min-jae's expression softened when he was lost in his art, the quiet determination in his eyes when he focused on a sketch. She wondered what his life had been like, what had brought him to this place. Min-jae, too, found himself drawn to the quiet strength beneath Ji-yeon's reserved exterior. There was a depth to her that intrigued him, a sense of hidden stories waiting to be told. He noticed the way her fingers tightened around her notebook when she was deep in thought, the faraway look in her eyes when she stared at the river. Their connection was unspoken but undeniable, a silent understanding that grew with each passing day. One afternoon, as they sat side by side, Min-jae hesitated for a moment before opening his sketchpad and showing Ji-yeon one of his drawings. It was a rough sketch of the bench by the river, with two figures sitting side by side, a quiet tribute to their shared moments. Ji-yeon stared at the drawing, her expression unreadable. Then, without a word, she opened her notebook and began to sketch. Her hands moved quickly, her lines confident and precise, and when she was done, she handed the notebook to him. Min-jae's breath caught in his throat as he looked at the sketch. It was a mirror image of his drawing, but with one difference. In Ji-yeon's version, the figures were closer together, their shoulders almost touching. He looked at her, and for the first time he saw a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was small, barely there, but it was enough. But life, as always, had a way of testing even the strongest connections. Ji-yeon's father's condition began to deteriorate rapidly, and she found herself pulled back into a world of hospital visits, endless phone calls, and sleepless nights. The publishing house, which had been struggling for years, demanded her full attention, and her own dreams were pushed to the sidelines. She stopped going to the river, stopped sketching, stopped writing. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, suffocating and relentless. Min-jae noticed her absence immediately. The bench felt emptier without her, and the silence, once comforting, now felt oppressive. He tried to focus on his art, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Ji-yeon. He wanted to help, to be there for her, but he didn't know how. And so he waited. He returned to the bench every morning, hoping that she would come back. Days turned into weeks, and still, she didn't appear. But Min-jae didn't give up. He kept drawing, kept sketching, pouring his emotions onto the page as he waited for her to find her way back. One evening, Ji-yeon sat in her father's hospital room, watching the rise and fall of his chest as he slept. Her notebook lay open on her lap, but the pages were blank. She felt lost, adrift in a sea of grief and uncertainty. She had spent so long trying to hold everything together, to be strong for her father, for the publishing house, for herself. But now, she wasn't sure if she had anything left to give. Her gaze fell on a sketch Min-jae had drawn, a simple but heartfelt depiction of the bench by the river, with two figures sitting side by side. Tears welled in her eyes as she traced the lines with her fingertips. She missed him. She missed the quiet comfort of their shared moments, the way he had made her feel seen and understood. And for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to hope. The rain fell softly that morning, a gentle drizzle that cast a silvery haze over the city. The Han River, usually bustling with life, was quiet and subdued, its surface rippling under the touch of the falling rain. The bench by the river, once a sanctuary for Ji-eun and Min-jae, stood empty, droplets clinging to its weathered surface. Min-jae sat under the canopy of a nearby tree, his sketchpad balanced on his knees. He hadn't drawn much that day. His lines were tentative, hesitant, as though reflecting the uncertainty in his heart. He had come to the river every day, hoping to see Ji-eun, but she hadn't returned. He told himself to be patient, that she would come back when she was ready. But a part of him couldn't help wondering if she had moved on, if their quiet connection had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in time. He closed the sketchpad with a sigh, brushing rainwater from his coat as he rose to leave. But just as he turned away, he saw her. Ji-eun stood at the edge of the river, her hair damp from the rain, her shoulders slightly hunched as though weighed down by an invisible burden. She didn't see him at first. Her gaze was fixed on the water, her expression distant and unreadable. Min-jae hesitated for a moment before walking toward her, his footsteps muffled by the wet grass. When he reached her, she turned to look at him, and in that instant, he saw the weariness in her eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. Without a word, he gestured toward the bench. Ji-eun nodded, and together they walked to their usual spot, sitting side by side as the rain continued to fall around them. For a long time they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The river flowed steadily before them, its quiet persistence a reminder that life too moved forward, even in the face of sorrow. Ji-eun opened her notebook, her fingers trembling slightly as she flipped to a blank page. She began to draw, her lines slow and deliberate, as though each stroke was an act of defiance against the chaos that had taken over her life. Min-jae watched her out of the corner of his eye, his heart aching for her. He wanted to ask what had happened, to understand the pain that lingered in her eyes. But he knew that some things couldn't be rushed, that sometimes the only way to heal was to let the silence do the talking. When she finished the sketch, Ji-eun handed him the notebook without looking up. Min-jae took it carefully, his breath catching as he saw what she had drawn. It was a sketch of the two of them sitting on the bench, their shoulders barely touching, with the river flowing endlessly behind them. But there was something different about this drawing, something softer, more hopeful. In the sketch, the rain had stopped, and a single beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a gentle glow over them. Min-jae stared at the drawing for a long time, his throat tight with emotion. He knew what it meant. Knew that it was Ji-eun's way of telling him she wasn't ready to give up, that she still believed in the possibility of something better. He looked at her, and when their eyes met, he saw a glimmer of the girl he had met weeks ago, the one who had sketched trees and rivers and dreams, even when the world felt like it was falling apart. The days that followed were a blur of small, quiet moments that slowly began to stitch the pieces of Ji-eun's fractured world back together. Min-jae became her anchor, her constant in a life that felt increasingly uncertain. He walked with her along the river, their footsteps in sync, their silence as comforting as any conversation. He brought her cups of hot tea when the rain turned cold, his presence steady and unwavering. And in return, Ji-eun let him in. She showed him the sketches she had never shared with anyone else, the ones that spoke of her deepest fears and her quietest hopes. She told him about her father, about the publishing house, about the weight of expectations that had followed her for as long as she could remember. Min-jae listened without judgment, his quiet empathy a balm to her wounded soul. He shared his own story, too, of the art school he had left behind, the career he had built out of necessity rather than passion, and the grief that had left him questioning everything he thought he wanted. Together, they began to rebuild, to find light in the shadows, hope in the quiet moments, and strength in each other. But life, as always, had one more test in store for them. One morning, as Ji-eun sat by her father's bedside, She felt his hand tighten weakly around hers. His eyes, once so full of life, were dim and tired, but there was a spark of recognition in them as he looked at her. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he gestured toward the stack of manuscripts on the table, the manuscripts that had been gathering dust ever since Ji-eun had taken over the publishing house. Understanding dawned in Ji-eun's eyes. She reached for the top manuscript, her heart heavy with emotion, and began to read aloud. Her voice was soft and trembling at first, but as the story unfolded, she grew more confident, her words filling the room with warmth and life. Her father listened, a faint smile playing at his lips, and for a moment, it was as though time had stood still, as though they were back in the living room of their old house, where Ji-eun had once sat on his lap, listening to him read bedtime stories. When she finished the story, her father gave her hand a final, gentle squeeze, and Ji-eun knew, without needing to be told, that he was at peace. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ji-eun returned to the river. The air was cool and crisp, and the cherry blossoms swayed gently in the breeze, their petals falling like snow. Min-jae was waiting for her, his sketchpad resting on his lap, his expression thoughtful. When he saw her, he stood up, his eyes searching hers for answers. Ji-eun walked toward him, her step steady and sure, and when she reached him, she took his hand in hers, a silent gesture of gratitude, of hope, of something that didn't need words to be understood. Together they sat on the bench, their shoulders touching, as the river flowed endlessly before them, a reminder that life, like the water, was ever-changing, ever-moving, and full of possibilities yet to be discovered. The quiet beauty of early summer settled over the city, bringing with it longer days, balmy nights, and the soft hum of cicadas in the evenings. The Han River glistened in the sunlight, reflecting the gentle sway of willow branches and the vivid hues of wildflowers blooming along its banks. Life continued its quiet rhythm, and amidst the bustling backdrop of Seoul, something gentle and beautiful was unfolding between Ji-eun and Min-jae. In the weeks following her father's funeral, Ji-eun had found herself slowly coming back to life. The days no longer stretched endlessly before her, hollow and listless. Instead, they were filled with small, precious moments, moments that brought her a quiet kind of joy. She had Min-jae to thank for that. His presence had become a constant in her life, grounding her, anchoring her to something real and steady. At first, it had been subtle, a quiet companionship that asked for nothing and offered everything. But as the days turned into weeks, Ji-eun began to realize that her feelings for Min-jae had grown into something more. It wasn't a sudden realization. There was no grand moment of clarity, no sudden jolt of awareness. Instead, it was like a river carving its way through the landscape. Slow, steady, inevitable. She felt it in the way her heart fluttered when he smiled at her, in the way her breath caught whenever their fingers brushed accidentally. She felt it in the way her world seemed a little brighter when he was near, in the way his quiet presence brought her a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. And yet, Ji-eun wasn't sure what to do with these feelings. She wasn't sure if Min-jae felt the same, or if what she was feeling was something fleeting, born out of gratitude and shared grief. So she kept her feelings hidden, tucked away in the quiet corners of her heart, where they pulsed softly, like the flickering glow of fireflies on a summer night. Min-jae, too, had found himself changing in ways he hadn't expected. Since meeting Ji-eun, his world had shifted, expanding to include the quiet, beautiful moments they shared. He had started painting again, but this time his work was different. It was no longer filled with the dark, chaotic energy that had once consumed him. Instead, it was infused with warmth, light, and a quiet sense of hope. His sketchpad was filled with images of Ji-eun, her eyes, her smile, the way her hair caught the light when she tilted her head just so. He captured the quiet strength in her gaze, the softness in her expression when she thought no one was watching. And with every stroke of his pencil, with every brush of color, Min-jae felt himself falling deeper in love. But like Ji-eun, he wasn't sure how to express what he was feeling. He had never been good with words, and the thought of laying his heart bare terrified him. So he let his paintings do the talking, hoping that somehow Ji-eun would understand. One warm afternoon, Jiyeon invited Min-jae to her father's house. She had been slowly going through her father's belongings, sorting through old photo albums, dusty records, and stacks of forgotten books. It was a bittersweet task, but with Min-jae by her side, it felt a little less daunting. Together, they climbed up to the attic, a small, sunlit space filled with memories. Jiyeon opened an old trunk and pulled out a stack of drawings, crayon sketches of castles, dragons, and faraway lands. She laughed softly as she flipped through them, the sound light and musical, like the chiming of wind chimes in the breeze. Min-jae watched her with a gentle smile, his heart swelling at the sight of her laughter. It was the first time he had heard her laugh like that. And in that moment, he knew that he wanted to be the reason she laughed like that every day. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. Jiyeon's laughter faded, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide and searching. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the air between them charged with something unspoken, something electric. But before either of them could say or do anything, Jiyeon looked away, her cheeks flushing as she busied herself with the drawings. Min-jae sighed softly, his heart aching with the weight of everything he wanted to say but couldn't. The days passed in a blur of golden sunlight and quiet moments, and before they knew it, summer was in full bloom. Jiyeon and Min-jae had settled into a comfortable rhythm, spending their days together and their evenings by the river, watching the sun set over the water. One evening, Min-jae led Jiyeon to a small gallery tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The space was warm and inviting, with soft lighting that cast a golden glow over the walls. Jiyeon's breath caught in her throat as she took in the paintings that lined the gallery. They were all Min-jae's, a collection of his work that spanned years, from his early sketches to the vibrant, expressive pieces he had created in recent months. But it wasn't just the paintings that took her breath away. It was what they represented. Each piece told a story, capturing moments of joy, sorrow, and quiet resilience. And at the center of it all, there was she. Jiyeon stood in front of a painting that depicted the bench by the river, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. In the painting, two figures sat side by side, their shoulders touching, their faces turned toward the horizon. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized what Min-jae had done. He had painted their story, every moment, every quiet exchange, every unspoken feeling, onto the canvas, turning it into something beautiful and lasting. That night, they returned to the river, the air cool and crisp as they walked side by side. The city lights shimmered on the water, casting a soft, golden glow over the surface. They reached the bench and sat down, their shoulders touching as they always did. But this time, there was something different, something that hung in the air between them, fragile and beautiful, like the first petals of spring. Min-jae reached for Jiyeon's hand, his fingers brushing against hers in a silent question. Jiyeon hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before she laced her fingers with his, her grip firm and sure. A gentle breeze rustled through the cherry trees, carrying with it the scent of blossoms and the promise of a new beginning. Jiyeon leaned her head against Min-jae's shoulder, and together they watched the river flow past, their hearts beating in perfect harmony. In the days that followed, their love continued to bloom, quiet and steady, like a song that only they could hear. They found joy in the simplest of things, a shared cup of coffee, a walk through the park, a stolen glance that spoke volumes. Jiyeon started bringing Min-jae's sketches to the publishing house, turning them into illustrated stories that captured the magic of their journey. Min-jae, in turn, painted portraits of Jiyeon, each one more beautiful and vibrant than the last. Their love became a tapestry of small, quiet moments, moments that wove together to create something strong, something lasting, something real. One evening, as they sat by the river watching the sun set over the horizon, Jiyeon felt a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in a long time. She turned to look at Min-jae, her heart full to bursting, and in that moment she knew that she had found her home, not in a place, but in a person. Min-jae met her gaze, his eyes soft and full of love, and without a word he leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a kiss that spoke of love, of gratitude, of forever. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of gold and pink, Jian and Minjae sat together, their hearts entwined, ready to face whatever the future might hold, together.